Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Hampton, and I attended my first systematic review and meta-analysis training in 2013. It was offered by the Joanna Briggs Institute, and in case you're unfamiliar, Joanna Briggs is the nursing equivalent to the Cochrane Collaboration for Medicine. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses sit at the top of the evidence pyramid, and when they are of high quality, they're the ideal source to guide our practice with best evidence. The more we know about how they're constructed, the better we'll be in our attempts to conduct reviews ourselves and to interpret and apply their findings. This video is intended to accompany the Writing Center's Systematic Literature Review and Meta-Analysis Reports Genre Guide, so having that handy might be helpful as you watch this tutorial. The guide has four main sections: content, style, organization, and process. I'll discuss each as described in the genre guide and also refer to the accompanying example. When I searched for examples, I immediately thought of Dr. Marilyn Orman, who's a professor at Duke University and the editor-in-chief of the journal Nurse Educator. She's a prolific writer and foremost expert in scholarly writing. The book image you see here is the fourth edition of Writing for Publication in Nursing. It's a great resource that you might consider investing in. The systematic review I've chosen to use as an example is titled Systematic Review of Educational Programs and Strategies for Developing Students and Nurses' Writing Skills. The example includes notations in red that represent skills described in the scientific writing assessment, and I'll be discussing that in depth in this video. The notations in blue represent the organization or structural elements of the paper. If you find that the paper is difficult to read due to the markup, you can also retrieve a clean copy of the study. The first area to tackle is content. Nothing else matters until you have substantive content as the foundation of your review. To guide the discussion of content, I'll be referring to the skill areas identified in the scientific writing assessment. I recommend you retrieve the full document, including the rubric, that defines each skill. There's also a user guide in the full document that you might find useful to understand each one. To avoid confusing the use of the term organization in the genre guide versus its use in the scientific writing assessment, I'll be referring to each of the three subgroups in the scientific writing assessment as SWA Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3. There are 4 skills in SWA Category 2, and all relate to content. Content that's substantive is content that's supported by research evidence. If you pay attention to studies that you read, there's not much in the background or opening section of a paper that's not cited from another source. And this is no different whether you're talking about a research report or a review. You always need a thorough review of the literature in the background of your paper. You'll work to emulate this in your writing, and your use of references will be most critical in the background and discussion sections. If you think back to what you learned about the construction of a paragraph, the main theme is supported by evidence, and then the author provides a reference. And that's often sandwiched between some transitional statements. If you're trying to write and having a tough time figuring out what to say, there's a good chance that you haven't done enough reading. So take a step back from your laptop, or pen and paper if you prefer, and take the time to read. Then be sure to cite your sources when you get back to writing. Once you've mastered the skill of citing sources, you want to be sure you're citing the primary source or the original source of the data, and then paraphrasing the findings in your own words. Let's look at our review example again. The Troxler reference used here is an integrative review. One error that a novice writer might make is to take the findings of one study included in the Troxler review and to credit that to Troxler rather than the original author. This is a mistake. To cite the findings of a review, you want to cite the unique findings of the review or the conclusions drawn from the results of the meta-analysis or synthesis of information from all of the included studies. In this case, Dr. Orman lists the various types of writing programs represented in the collection of included studies. Note also that the author identifies the paper as an integrative review. It's important for the reader to make that distinction for the interpretation of the results. For an example of how to paraphrase raw data from the results section of a single study report, I recommend you take a look at the Evidence-Based Practice Report Genre Guide and video. The quality of sources is also important. You can imagine that we could easily find an obscure website or article to support just about any point of view, so there are some rules of thumb to keep in mind when selecting sources. A useful exercise is to review the reference list of this or other studies that you read or other reviews. You'll likely notice that most of the studies were published within 5 years of the publication date, possibly 10 if more recent studies are unavailable. And then the authors will usually point this out if that's the case. Peer-reviewed sources such as journals, conference papers, and abstracts go through a process of scrutiny by experts in the field prior to publication. You might also find that government reports or agencies are also used as sources of data. This isn't an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the more common sources of data. The components of SWA Category 3 that pertain to content are clear and narrow focus, critical appraisal, and evidence synthesis. Have you ever seen a person learning how to spin in a dance? Every rotation, the dancer is encouraged to select a focal point for each rotation to avoid getting dizzy. A clear and narrow focus is similar to that in that it refocuses the reader on the main theme of the paper in each subsequent section. At the beginning of the introduction, we're alerted to the main theme of this paper, written communication skills in nursing students. We see it again in the methods, the results, discussion, and in the conclusions. Using consistent terminology and staying focused on the central theme of the paper without veering off to tangential material is key to your reader following your point and being able to understand and apply your work. The next example combines the skills of critical appraisal and evidence synthesis. Sometimes novice writers present information about research evidence, one study, one paragraph at a time. But experienced writers group information by topic and often cite multiple sources at once when the findings are congruent. And though a lot of what you cite will be a summary of the findings of those studies, there are times when you'll need to provide some critical analysis of the study, such as the quality of the study's methods, its results, or its applicability to your work. In this example, Dr. Orman and colleagues note that while Troxler's review indicates that writing programs on the surface appear to improve students' writing skills, standalone programs that are offered just one time don't give students the opportunity to practice writing, to receive feedback, or to develop over time. Organization refers to the structure of your paper. In a course, you might have a rubric with specific headings and subheadings that are required. In many ways, the structure of a systematic review or meta-analysis follows the structure of a research report, also known as the IMRAD formula. Each section, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion, answers fundamental questions. Remember that you can see the answers to these questions in the example by looking at the notations in blue. The introduction answers the questions, what's the problem, what do we know about it, what's unknown, and what's the purpose for the review. One of the major ways a research report differs from a systematic review in the introduction is that in a research report, the gap is usually that there's a lack of research evidence in a particular area. Whereas for a systematic review, the gap is that despite a good amount of research publication in the field, it hasn't yet been synthesized. Remember that, unlike a research report that often has human participants, a review is a study of studies. This is why we won't see a statement about IRB approval. The methods section answers the questions, what was the approach to the review? Was it qualitative or quantitative? What studies were included? What was the search process? How were studies selected for inclusion? What outcomes were chosen? How were those measured? And how were the data pooled and analyzed? Similar to a research report, the methods section typically has very few citations because it's the author's unique approach to their review. The results section answers the questions: what were the general characteristics of the included studies? What were the findings of the studies individually according to the outcomes chosen? And what were the results of the pooled analysis? A PRISMA flowchart is usually included to illustrate the sequence of events for the review. Note how the initial search return is listed at the top and the number and rationale for the reduction of studies is given in sequence until you get to the final total of included studies at the end. The included studies, an N of 80 in this review, is all that we would see discussed and analyzed in the review's results section. The results reported might include a forest plot if the data are quantitative and sufficiently comparable, like mortality rates or fall rates that might result from a particular intervention. If the outcomes are not comparable or the data are qualitative, a narrative analysis can be used. And rather than centering the reporting around graphs and tables, you'll notice subheadings and text for the reporting of results, similar to what we saw in Orman's review. The discussion then highlights the most meaningful results and interprets them in the context of other published studies. Similar to a research report based upon an individual study, the review's findings might reinforce or refute what we already know or think we know about a phenomenon. Finally, the paper ends with a discussion of the review's limitations and recommendations for practice and/or future research. Style refers primarily to fundamental skills and reference management styles like APA format. There are 4 skills in SWA Category 1. Health science writing can include a lot of complex terminology, so it's always helpful to use shorter sentences when you can and opt for shorter and more simple terms. Another helpful tip is to keep the subject and the verb really close to one another so that your writing is as clear as possible. You can also use tools like Grammarly, Turnitin, or Microsoft Word to check your grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Whichever reference style that your faculty or a journal requires, keep in mind that it applies not only to in-text and reference list citation, but there are also other rules to follow, such as line spacing, font size and style, page numbers, and acronym use, just to name a few. Purdue OWL is a user-friendly site that has 3 different reference styles available. Not only can you search the site for specific information that you need, but you can also take a look at sample papers to see what a properly formatted paper looks like. Further, I recommend that you refer to SWA Category 2 for guidelines and suggestions about the use of headings and subheadings so that you can create a roadmap for your reader and improve the logical flow of your paper. MRAD is the overarching structure of the systematic review and meta-analysis, but where it differs is within the subcomponents of the methodology and reporting of results. You'll find a link to the PRISMA guidelines under additional resources in the genre guide. And last but not least, as you proofread your paper, not only do you want to correct any obvious errors, but you also want to take out any unnecessary repetition. Novice writers who might be unsure of where certain information belongs might repeat it in a number of places. You can review the example paper shared or one in your area of interest. If you haven't already, it's also a good idea to familiarize yourself with the Joanna Briggs and Cochrane databases for systematic reviews. You can also talk to your faculty or a writing mentor for clarification. The last section of the genre guide is the writing process. I've created a separate video that describes my process in detail, but every writer will develop their own based on trial and error. If you find that you're having trouble getting started, you feel overwhelmed with the volume of information you're trying to manage, or you just want to hear how another writer does it, I recommend you check it out. If you'd like to see any of the sample documents that I reference in the pre-writing preparation video, you can email me at michelle.hampton@sjsu.edu. And don't forget to check out the additional resources at the end of the genre guide to help you master structure, content, and style.